evening. Welcome to Regent College. Welcome to our university here at the campus. This beautiful evening here in Vancouver, here in the West Coast. Welcome to all of you who are here with us in person. And welcome to all of you who join us online from anywhere around the world you may be. My name is Pablo. I am a student here at Regent. And as we get started, we would like to acknowledge that Regent College sits on the traditional, unceded, ancestral territories of the Musqueam First Nation people. Tonight, we are in for a great lecture, not only interesting, but relevant for the times we are living. If you are already subscribed to newsletter, email updates, you know how relevant it is to be up to date about everything that is happening here at Regent, all the events that we have, lectures and resources that we have. If you have not registered to receive email updates, I would like to invite you to do so. All you have to do is to grab one of these little blue cards that we have all the way to the back by the donations box. And by following the link on the blue side, you can register yourself digitally, or you can fill in the information here, and we will register you on our end. Before we start, if you have any electronic device that may produce any sound, now is the time to put it in silent mode. We will really appreciate it, as we would not like any disruptions to our lecture tonight. It's so interesting that any beep or buzz or ring will not be welcome. So please put it on silent mode. We'd really appreciate that. Lastly, those of you who are here with us in person, please be reminded that we are recording and live streaming this event, this lecture, under the conditions spelled out in the public notice posted on the doors here of Chapel and the doors of Regent. At this time, I would like to introduce Professor Dr. Paul Spilsbury. He is our president here at Regent and professor of New Testament. He will be our host tonight. Professor.
Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see you. Thanks for coming tonight. We're all very excited for this public lecture as part of our ongoing series of public lectures here at Regent College. It's a great tradition we have of wonderful engagement with important subjects, and tonight is going to be one of the good ones. It's a delight to be with you all. As a matter of just personal interest to me, this is my first public event as the president of Regent College. Oh, I should just say that. So, our evening will take the normal form. Tonight we will have a lecture that will run for about 50 minutes or so. We'll see how long that goes. And then after the talk, we will have an opportunity for Q&A. For those of you who are here in the building, we've got mics set up on the two sides. So please do, after the talk is completed, make your way to one of the mics, and you can stand in line. There'll be a long lineup. Well, there'll be a few people waiting, hopefully. So be thinking as you're going through the talk of a good question that you would like to ask to our speaker. Of course, keeping it really succinct and to the point so that we don't have multiple extra lectures this evening. And for those of you who are online who would like to send in a question, you can do so as well by sending in your questions by email to questions@regent-college.edu. So we'll have Q&A for about a half an hour or so, and then that will bring our evening to a close at around 9 p.m. So now it's my privilege and honor to introduce our speaker this evening. Professor John M. Owen IV is the Ambassador Henry J. and Mrs. Marion R. Taylor Professor of Politics and a Senior Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. He's the author of numerous volumes, the most recent of which is The Ecology of Nations, published in 2023, which recently received the 2025 Grawemeyer Award for World Order. He has published essays in numerous journals and other publications, including First Things, Providence, Christian Scholars Review, Foreign Affairs, the Hedgehog Review, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. Dr. Owen has held fellowships at Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Oxford, and the Free University of Berlin, and also here at the University of British Columbia. He has served on boards of different kinds, including the Consortium of Christian Study Centers and the Center for Christian Study in Charlottesville. He is married to Trish, and together they have 3 adult sons, and have had a long association. Oh, it says children. So, my mistake. Daughters. Wouldn't want to get that wrong. In 2 weeks' time, Dr. Owen is teaching a course here in our summer programs called Christianity and Politics. So if you like what you hear tonight, you can sign up for that course. That begins on July the 21st as part of our summer programs. And so now, without any further ado, please welcome Dr. Owen as he comes to speak to us on the topic, What's Wrong with Democracy?
Good. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Pablo. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight, and those watching, or I guess yet to watch, thank you for tuning in. It really is a great privilege to be delivering one of these public lectures at Regent. I've been coming to these things for years, so I know some of your faces because you're friends, and then other faces I just know from these lectures, I guess. I want to say I have family ties to Regent through my wife, Trish. Some of you will remember Phil and Marguerite Hill, who were involved at Regent in various ways from the 1970s, from the origins, through just a few years ago when Phil passed away. So it's really lovely to be doing this and teaching my course later this month. Regent College is a precious thing. And if the Lord tarry, may he give it many, many more decades of ministry. So my lecture is titled, What's Wrong with Democracy? That's a deliberately ambiguous question. It can change, the meaning can change with the inflection. You know, what's wrong with democracy? Or what's wrong with democracy? Or I could go on, but so I'm going to mostly mean by the question tonight, what is ailing democracy? Starting with my own country to the south of the border, which I imagine you've heard a few things about recently, but there's a general phenomenon, nearly global. Lots of democracies are wobbly, let's say. And I also will say a little bit about defending democracy, constitutional liberal democracy, because it's under some attack, including from some Christians who aren't sure it's really the right regime anymore. So let's get started. Yeah. Democracy is in trouble the world over. Here's some images. Left, this is Xi Jinping, president of China and head of the Communist Party there, and a number of other titles in a recent talk. On the right is January 6, 2021 in the United States in Washington. And there are lots of other pictures. I just grabbed these off the web because they're familiar. But we have the world's 2 greatest powers. I put China up here. China is not a liberal democracy, but it was thought to be headed in that direction until certainly in the 80s, and again, maybe a little bit in the 90s and the early aughts of this century, and that talk is all over. China is more authoritarian than it's been since the era of Chairman Mao. Probably don't need to say much about the image on the right. I do want to say it's not just a phenomenon in the United States or even the West. So there are a couple of graphs here. One is a colleague and I put the top one together. This is the World Values Survey, which is done over a pretty well-funded project that asks people in a number of different countries around the world a battery of questions. And one of the questions is, what do you think of democracy as a form of government? Pretty open-ended. And the downward slope in the line, so the blue line is statistically fitting a line to all those dots that are scattered all over the place. But you can see that there's a decline. That means that for the, over the, I can't even read, but it's the last 25, 30 years, opinions around the world of democracy as a good system of government are declining. It was over 50% approved of democracy. And these are the same countries over a number of years. So it's controlling for the country. So that's a discouraging trend if you think democracy is a good thing. And the bottom is actually one of many, many indices that social scientists put together trying to trace the growth in the number of democracies and also the number of people in the world who live in a democratic country. And you can see this one begins some years ago. I think is this going to work? Yeah. So not a dramatic slope because of the way I scaled it, but the basic message is for a few decades in the late 20th century, there was a gentle but real upward curve. The really steep one about halfway through is 1989. You remember that, Eastern Europe, communism fell in Eastern Europe. But you can see there's a downward slope here as well. So we're not the way we were back in 1960, globally speaking, but the trend is not great. And again, it wasn't supposed to be this way. On the left are some best-selling books from the 1990s. The top one, The End of History and the Last Man, is still famous. I still assign this book. Francis Fukuyama wrote it. Below it is a book by Michael Mandelbaum. Very, very similar idea. The idea here was, I'll put it in Fukuyama's terms. History with a capital H is the story of the human race's arguments and struggles over the best way to organize society. And in the 1990s, we finally have the answer. It's liberal democracy. Communism's finished in all but name. And this thesis, lots of people disagreed with Fukuyama, but it was an agenda-setting book. If you disagreed with Fukuyama, you had to say why. On the right are some books of more recent vintage. I remember 20 years ago, I was kind of interested in teaching a course on fascism, and students just were not remotely interested. That sounds like it belongs in the history department. Well, now people are really paying attention to what was this fascism thing, and below it is How Democracies Die. That's a best-selling book by a couple of political scientists. So wasn't supposed to be this way. This is for people my age, and some of you are my age or older. You remember the 90s. This wasn't supposed to happen. So let me get a little more precise about what I mean. What is the thing that's in trouble? And I've been throwing around the word democracy. That's in the title, but I've already also used this modifier, liberal democracy. So by liberal, I'm going to talk a lot about liberalism tonight and the liberal aspect of liberal democracy. I do mean a type of political regime, so I'm going to get a little bit political sciencey here, just for a moment. Fundamental laws and institutions. So liberal democracy is not really a set of policies or laws, unless by laws you mean fundamental laws, a constitution, a bill of rights. You could say rules about rules, right? So liberal democracy is one of a number of regime types that the human race has had. Fascism would be another, communism. Liberal democracies come in various types. Canada and the US have many differences in the way they do liberal democracy, but we generally put them in the same bin, along with a number of countries in Asia and Europe and Africa and Latin America. But we use two words, liberal and democracy. Democracy, pretty straightforward. In theory, it's majority rule from the Greek, demos, the people, the commoners, and krasi derived from the Greek word for power or rule. Liberalism, a little bit trickier. I don't mean caring government or big government. By liberalism, I really mean something that in most Western countries stretches across right, left, and center, or has done. It's really a strong commitment to individual liberty or non-coercion. The idea that the individual, you and me and other citizens, as individuals, not just as members of groups, but as individuals have certain rights. claims that the state is bound to honor freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, the right to a speedy trial, and so on. And again, it's really important that liberalism says these rights accrue to individuals, not just groups. Everybody has them. If you're a citizen, you have them. Yeah, just because you're a citizen. So liberal democracy is really a hybrid regime. And it's really important to get clear on this. It's hybrid in that democracy and liberalism aren't the same thing. We can, and again, in shorthand, we use democracy to cover liberal democracy. But you can't maximize over time democracy and liberalism all the time. They're trade-offs. You have to make trade-offs. And part of what liberal democracies do, part of the stuff of politics in our countries is negotiating those trade-offs. So, for example, in a well-functioning liberal democracy, the majority might want to persecute a minority and take away their rights. But the liberal part kicks in and says, you can't do that. You may not like these people, they may not like you, but they're citizens, so you have to respect the rights. And a lot of the struggles that go on are how to do that, or what do you mean we have to respect their rights, and so on. But the idea is everybody gets the same rights. So it's a hybrid and the tension's built in. It's supposed to be a productive tension, but it's just there. It's inescapable. Before I go on, I want to say a little bit about why Christians in the church should care about this. And you may think, well, of course we should care, but today a lot of people aren't completely sure. They want this clarified. After all, liberalism's not in the Bible. In fact, democracy. There were democracies in the ancient world. You know about ancient Athens, but Palestine, the Roman Empire, these weren't democracies. The Roman Empire had the rule of law of a certain sort, right? But these are categories. This is a regime type that has not existed throughout human history, and it doesn't exist in either the ancient Hebrew world or the ancient Near East. Just isn't there. So we do have to think a little bit about this. Why, ought we to be so attached to this regime type as Christians? A second thing that comes up in these discussions is, well, churches, if you know your church history, churches haven't really come to embrace liberal democracy. Some did it before others, but until recent centuries, or even decades, you could say, in the case of some churches. And some aren't, in some parts of the world, still aren't on board with liberal democracy. So that's a little odd. Were our forebears, say in the European Middle Ages, just flat out wrong? Were they misguided? Were they misinterpreting Christian doctrine and not embracing a regime type? I mean, the answer is the regime didn't exist, actually. But was there some defect or some flaw? Or are we flawed? Maybe they knew something we didn't know. There's some recent critiques of liberal democracy that various Christians have lodged. I'll come back to this a little bit at the end of my lecture, but just to preview it. One type of critique says liberal democracy, especially the liberal part, presupposes human autonomy, another Greek-derived word, autos, self, nomos, law or governance or rule. So liberalism is, some versions of liberalism say this is based on individual autonomy. The autonomy is self-governing, makes his or her own rules and laws. So that doesn't seem Christian. We receive law. Law comes ultimately from the divine, from God, not from us. So that seems a problem. Another point Christian critics of liberal democracy sometimes make is that this is a competitive system. It's elitist. It's rife with injustice, so we shouldn't be attached to it. Maybe we should explore other types of regime. And a final critique you sometimes hear, you're hearing this increasingly, is under this regime that maybe lots of, especially people in the West, but not only the West, have been very attached to, we're now seeing in the 21st century churches are shrinking. Public morality is deteriorating. We see things that the church doesn't approve of. As a rule, abortion, changing sexual identity, changes in the definition of marriage, the idea that it's not up to us when and how we die, it's up to God. That seems to be out the window in some places, right? We're now sovereign over the timing and manner of our own death. These are things that have happened in liberal democracies. And so some Christians are saying, what's so great about this system that is leading to these clearly unchristian policies and outcomes? It's making us into different sorts of people. It's harder to be a Christian in a liberal democracy now, so maybe we should rethink liberal democracy. So I'll come back to some of these. I'm not going to give full answers to these, but I'll come back to some of these later. But for now, let me just give some preliminary answers why the church really should want to preserve a liberal democracy. I want to make clear, I don't make a universalistic claim that liberal democracy actually has always been the best system, and it's only in recent centuries we've discovered it because we're so clever or something. I don't know. I do think if you're in a village in Burgundy in the year 1100, liberal democracy is not an option, and so you're not being disobedient by not pushing for liberal democracy. That I think I can say, but I do think under modern conditions, and I apologize for the small type, so I'll just quickly go over this. Under modern conditions, by which I mean robust and deep pluralism and the technologies we have, I think liberal democracy remains the best regime for human thriving, which is something Christians ought to care about. For individuals, but also for families, for communities, and indeed for churches. Our societies for centuries have been pluralistic. People really do disagree over the good life, over definitions of good and evil, and that seems to be permanent. In that kind of society, some kind of set of legal mechanisms is necessary to adjudicate between various claims among individuals and among groups. And over time, liberal democracies emerged as a pretty good way to handle. It's not perfect, but it's the least coercive system. There are limits, right, to pluralism. So, as is often said when political theorists talk about this, they say, yeah, when we say pluralism, we don't mean you can do whatever you want. No human sacrifice, okay? No selling children into slavery. There are certain things that are out of bounds. But there are broad boundaries that liberal democracies at their best allow people. I also mentioned technology. So I think this is especially acute in the internet age, and AI is here, and it's going to get bigger and, I don't know, better or worse. But these communication technologies put us in a different world than medieval France in many ways. It is much easier for the state to surveil, to monitor, to record, to keep track of us. And this is being run as a real-time experiment. There are countries that have more or less the same technology as a Western country, but the state is harnessing it and using it in a much more coercive way. And so authoritarianism in the 21st century is really quite coercive, and sometimes very subtly so. And so liberal democracy can be coercive too. In fact, any regime has to be coercive up to a point. But I think the most conducive to human freedom. Second, the Christian church has really thrived under liberal democracy, challenges notwithstanding. Again, it's not been perfect. Often, and I feel this myself, the regimes we live in do tolerate all sorts of vice that I wish they didn't, or I wish wasn't there. But that gets back to the argument from pluralism. There are trade-offs. There are agreements. They're really bargains that the churches have made with liberal democracy over the centuries. We won't try to take over. You let us do our thing, and we won't try to take over. We'll put up with things we think are really awful, really immoral, really displeasing to God. But in return, we get to do our thing. That's the bargain. And under that kind of bargain, I think on the whole, the churches have thrived, and we really need to attend to that. as Christians. And finally, liberal democracy is a complicated thing. It has roots in the so-called Enlightenment with a capital E, which is at least problematic for Christianity. But you can trace the roots of many of the components of liberal democracy to Christianity. So, for example, equal rights. Well, the Christians, along with the ancient Stoics in the Western context, were the first to come up with this idea that all souls really are equal before God. Prince and pauper, at the end of life, are on the same footing. As the old Spanish proverb goes, there are no pockets in a shroud, meaning you can't take it with you, right? This is quite different from most ancient, certainly ancient pagan cultures. Christianity has a notion of the doctrine of original sin. Certainly Western Christianity emphasizes this doctrine of original sin, that Adam and Eve sin, we inherit that sin, and no one's exempt from it. So again, the prince is as prone to sin as the pauper, as the peasant. And so there's not the spiritual hierarchy you see in some religions and some cultures. And finally, the Protestant Reformation plays a big role in the emergence of the individual conscience as a thing really to cherish, and therefore in religious toleration, which is an essential component of. So liberal democracy is not this foreign body that was invaded the church. Its origins are complex, but some of those origins come out of church history. All right. So what's gone wrong? What's the problem here? To look very quickly at the case of the United States, my own country, you hear a lot of diagnoses, right? We have a lot of clever people looking at this problem. And I'm going to say, this list I have, I think they're all valid to some extent. So one you often hear, well, it's the political rights, the populists, it's the MAGA, Donald Trump movement, they're the problem. So if they could somehow be got rid of or, die off or something, everything would be fine again. You sometimes say, well, wait, time out. What about the left? Wokeism, if you put them in charge, they could be just as authoritarian. So surely it's not just the far right, it's the far left. Then we have position 3, which is it's both. It's the interaction of the right and the left, and the people in the center feel left out. I have nowhere to go. I'm a political orphan, and these crazy people, these polarized people are the problem. The culture wars, and so on. A fourth thesis you often hear is trying to explain these first 3 in a way. It's technology. It's really the internet. It's taking us out of each other's physical presence. And I love that there are all these actual human bodies in the same room. This is wonderful. But it's kind of unusual. We do lots of things online, and we know social media leads to a different kind of discourse, a different kind of interaction. Sometimes it's fine, but often when it comes to politics, culture, and things people deeply care about, they become quite tribal. And so humans are prone to tribalism, but it seems like there's some smart people who say social media have exacerbated this problem. And finally, another attempt to explain all these problems, economic trends, right? We've got the rich keep getting richer, the poor keep getting poorer. We're in a situation in some countries, I think Canada less severely than the United States, where you really do have an economic polarization, and people know their life's chances, if they're near the bottom of the scale, really are not what they had been promised, and they resent it, and they're looking for a political fix. So again, all of these have some truth to them, but I want to talk about liberalism itself as something that has changed and that's really contributing to the problems of liberal democracy. Liberalism, again, the governing ideology of liberal democracy. Well, what is it? Let me unpack it a little bit more. I said something a minute ago about it, but political doctrine that asserts that individual liberty is the highest political good. I stress political good. Liberalism, there are liberal theorists who say politics is the chief human activity, and so individual liberty is the chief human good. Most liberal theorists say that's too extreme. One of the great things about liberalism is it allows you to decide what the highest human good is. You decide for yourself, or you can join a religious group. Or liberalism just insists when it comes to the political good, individual liberty is the highest good. But the actual human good, that's up to you. In fact, that's the secret sauce of liberalism. Some say, well, liberalism, let's restate that. It's the ability to live as you want to. Voluntary consent. You're not coerced into being a certain type of person or joining a particular group or staying in a church you don't believe in. And this gets to the origins of liberalism in the Reformation, Counter-Reformation period, early modern Europe, when religious pluralism really flowered. There was lots of violence, lots of misunderstanding, lots of attempts to solve, and some good things happened in those years. But the idea of the individual conscience being sacred, some said, really began to take hold. And princes, political authorities, began to realize, and this is interesting, it starts in the Netherlands, probably. The governments begin to realize, it looks like it's going to be okay if not all of my subjects adhere to the same religion as me. They can still be loyal to me. If I'm Catholic and they're Protestant, they can still be loyal to me. We never thought this would work. For centuries, we thought this was impossible. Lo and behold, it's impossible. Okay, this is all kind of abstract. What does it mean concretely? And this is where liberalism has changed over the centuries, really, because we have defined individual liberty differently across time and space. We've even defined what counts as an individual differently, right? So in my country, let's see, at the time of the founding, it really was adult property holding white males that were the individuals that had the rights. Over the centuries, that has expanded. The abolition of slavery is a big part of that, but lots of other things, women's suffrage, right? And the way people thought about liberty, the way they identified limits to liberty has changed also. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. Liberalism's adaptability, flexibility is really one of its secrets. It has outlasted, Fukuyama, the guy I mentioned a minute ago, is right about a number of things. One thing he's right about is, in the 1930s, it looked like fascism was the best system, and it lost, it overreached. In the 1950s, many smart people thought communism was going to beat liberal democracy, and it didn't. And one of the secrets of liberalism is it's supple, flexible, it's adaptable, whereas those ideologies proved to be much more rigid. But or this, right. Can we send it forward? Try to, nope, that is not me. It's much prettier than any of my slides, but it's not mine. Very good, thank you. All right, so over the past 250 years, we've really had three versions of liberalism. Each enjoyed a period of dominance. They've all been kind of there implicitly the whole time. But I'm going to say the first period was dominated by what we call classical liberalism, late 18th century to the early 20th century. Second was welfare liberalism. You can see the dates, early 20th century to the mid-70s, not that long ago. And what I call open liberalism has predominated since the late 70s. Each of these worked until it didn't. They had good decades. But when they stopped working, and I'll say more about what I mean by stop working in a minute, we have a transition where liberals are starting to rethink. So what does liberty mean in our time? Not 50 years ago, but what does it mean now? The world has changed. And so there's lots of argument about what liberty, individual liberty means, how to get it, what's the remedy. And do we need to rethink what the good life looks like? So, and I'm arguing we're actually in one of these periods now, whether we realize it or not. So here we go. So quickly, version 1, classical liberalism. On the left is Thomas Jefferson, author of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, founder of my university. He's very big in Charlottesville, Virginia. And on the right, Richard Cobden, who came a generation or two later, English Quaker industrialist, laissez-faire, known for laissez-faire economics. Anyway, these two never met, but they and many, many others were classical liberals. They believed that the chief threat to liberty was a despotic state. And you can call that the marriage of throne and altar. The state that limited people's life chances. It enforced rigid codes and could be quite oppressive when it came to religion, to where you lived, what you did for a living, and so on. So what's the remedy? And these states also, if they were monarchies, would set up monopolies. So they limited commerce, they limited the growth of wealth and the distribution of wealth. So the remedy, people like Jefferson and Cobden and others said, is need to shrink the state, make it smaller, disperse power across the state, don't let it concentrate in the hands of a single monarch. And this also involved movement to free market economics. And so the good life under the classical liberal notion was personal freedom of enterprise. Start your own business, own your own land, be a farmer. You know, you're not a tenant farmer, you are a freeholder. Freedom of association, you can join the religious denomination you want, you can leave it even. Freedom of contract and freedom of movement. If you don't like where you live, there are no jobs, go somewhere else, right? All of these things were limited in various ways under the old regime. And the classical liberals said, enough. Just watch. Watch what happens when we unleash people like this. And sure enough, there was lots of economic growth. This is a representative quotation from Tom Paine. Had an interesting career. He was a revolutionary. He said in The Rights of Man, which was a kind of celebration of the French Revolution, common interest regulates men's concerns and forms their law. And the laws which common usage ordains have a greater influence than the laws of government. So if that's a little bit obscure, he's just saying government does if we had a natural system of government, people would live according to laws that they make that sort of emerge spontaneously from human interaction. That's really most of what we need to regulate we don't need the state to come down on us heavily and make us do this and not do this other thing. That's artificial. That's holding us back as a human race. And he thought the French Revolution was going to fix that. That he clearly got wrong. But okay, version 2, welfare liberalism. Classical liberalism, it turns out, had many problems, many virtues, but it couldn't handle the Great Depression. It became very clear in the 1930s that this classical liberalism isn't up to the job, and to some really important people, powerful people. The rise of extremism, fascism, communism, I mentioned a minute ago. In liberal democracies, there were a lot of people who had decided liberal democracy had a good run, it's not working anymore. And look at Italy, fascist Italy, look at Nazi Germany. You know, they're a little rough, but they've got full employment. Or, if you prefer, look at the Soviet Union. Also kind of rough, Stalin, maybe not warm and fuzzy guy, but they've got full employment, where our countries can't put people back to work, right? So now the chief threat to liberty, many liberals have been saying this for decades, it's just they weren't listened to by the people in power. But now the idea is the chief threat to liberty is no longer the despotic state. We've taken care of that problem. It's now unfettered capital, money and people who use money to make more money. You know, Wall Street. What's the remedy? Well, now the liberal state, which is a tamed state, it's not the old despotic state, We'll regulate the economy. It's a democracy. We have multi-party competition. We'll put in the right people, like Franklin Roosevelt there at the top. And that's the way to make sure, state regulation is a way to make sure we have full employment, which was unemployment was such a massive problem in the 1930s. Employment for adult males, I throw in. The good life then is reconceived as really a life of economic security. It doesn't mean it quite as much to be able to move from the East Coast to the West Coast, fine. But, you know, in the Depression, that wasn't really helping people. They wanted the security. And so welfare liberalism came along to try to help them with that. The bottom character is John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian economics. He was a brilliant economist who theorized about how to do this properly. All right. This is a representative quotation from, you see it, 1911, so before Roosevelt and Keynes were doing their thing. L.T. Hobhouse, an English philosopher, the function of state coercion. Notice he says the state is going to be coercive. This is not the way Richard Cobden talked about the state. But the purpose is to overcome individual coercion. You're using coercion to fight coercion. And of course, coercion exercised by any association of individuals within the state. So, sort of darn right, we're going to be using the state to make people free, but that's going to involve some coercion. This is a new world we're in, right? Version 3, which we live under now, open liberalism. So welfare liberalism had, and I'm speaking sort of descriptively and really pragmatically, had some real successes, certainly politically, economically. It did the job for a while. Full employment, unemployment was not a problem, nearly the problem it had been in the 30s, so government had figured out how to smooth the boom-bust cycles of capitalism. But come the 60s and the 70s, welfare liberalism also began to encounter some trouble. Economic conditions were such that Keynesian economics didn't seem able to solve them. You had high unemployment and high inflation. Something Keynes would have said, I know how to handle that, but his methods were no longer working. And then you had the cultural upheaval of the late 60s, right? And so, and welfare liberalism was about security and conformity. If you look at I have my mother's high school yearbook from that kind of heyday of welfare liberalism. It's charming, but everyone looks the same. All the guys, and they all look older than high school students, frankly. They look like kind of like we do here in this. But everyone looks the same, and that, in the 60s, really in the 50s, a lot of people didn't like that, but in the 60s, this exploded, like, no more. We can't take this any. So you had these two shortcomings of welfare liberalism. And so liberals, again, began to rethink what do we mean by human liberty now? What are the threats to human liberty? And what do we do about this? And so the consensus answer that emerged is, well, old norms, institutions, boundaries, that's the problem. Not unfettered. We've tamed capital. We've tamed the despotic state. We now have a new set of problems that are standing in the way of human individual liberty. It's these old norms and institutions and boundaries. What's the remedy? Well, the state now and the private sector cooperate to fix this problem. We open boundaries. We open borders. This leads to what is often called globalization, or the eventual elimination of barriers to commerce, to the movement of goods, services, capital, money, and even labor, people, right? So this starts really in the 90s with the fall of the Soviet Union, and China definitely gets on board. And also, I put in here in quotes, the rights revolution, that is to say, flowering of different ways of life and a recognition that different lifestyles are equally valid, and conformity. If you want to look like it's 1955 in a high school in Illinois, go ahead, but there should be no conformist pressure to be that kind of person. We should be able to be the sorts of people we want. That's part of the good life. So I have here at the end, you see terms coming up like self-creation, expressive individualism, which is a phrase of Robert Bellah, the sociologist, fluidity, liquidity, and also this idea of control. I am sovereign as an individual over all sorts of things, decisions that used to be made by society or the state. Now I get to decide. That's what we mean by freedom. A few quotes about the logic of open liberalism. I'm belaboring this a little bit because it's a system I say we live under. This is first is from Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher. Our understanding of life is that each one of us has his or her own way of realizing our humanity, and that it is important to find and live out one's own as against surrendering to conformity with the model imposed on us from outside by society, by the previous generation, or religious or political authority. So we wrote that almost 20 years ago. That's the sort of the cultural side. Then the economic side, voiced by Alan Greenspan, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve in the States for a while. Hardly makes any difference who will be the next president. The world is governed by market forces, speaking at sort of the peak of globalization, right? This is before, he said this 2007, so the election in the U.S. is between Barack Obama and John McCain, and Greenspan said, actually, it doesn't really matter. You can pretend, but it doesn't really matter. And then the political theorist Mark Lilla said very astutely before any of this, he said the cultural and Reagan revolution, the cultural is the 60s, nonconformity. The Reagan revolution is the economic side. Deregulation, globalization, have proved to be complementary, not contradictory events. They come from different places, right? We associate, Reagan, who was an enemy of the hippies when he was governor of California. So ironically, you're seeing the outcome of the cultural revolution of the 60s and the Reagan-Thatcher, et cetera, revolution converging into this, what I call open liberalism. So I come not to completely bury open liberalism, but to praise it in a limited extent. Extended rights to more people, right? Vast wealth creation. So globalization, which has a bad odor for so many people, but it did create wealth, including in the global south. I'll show you a graph in a minute that will illustrate this. But the rise of China, 800 million people, you see this phrase everywhere, lifted out of poverty, because the Chinese Communist Party made some decisions. They should get credit for that, but opening China to the rest of the world, and it worked. It's the largest generation of wealth in a country in human history in such a compressed period of time. And by the way, open liberalism adopted by Reagan, Thatcher, and others played some role, certainly a lot of us think, in defeating the Soviet Union, winning the Cold War. And I could go on. There's some other things about it. It's so much easier to travel overseas and get around. I think this is very normal for me to come to Canada and do this kind of thing. I was in Portugal last month. I don't know. It's a world where it's so easy to move about, right? But there have been disruptions, and this gets us to the present day. What's wrong with democracy again? So economic disruption. So on the left, graphs like this were quite common when Donald Trump started his political rise. This is from The Economist magazine a few years ago, and the red downward bending curve is manufacturing employment as percentage of working age population in the U.S. All right, so the percentage of Americans working in manufacturing dropped from 12% to 6% between 1990 and 2016. In fact, 2010. So in 20 years, it dropped in half. Meanwhile, the blue bars show goods imported from China. Now, this is just correlation. It's not causation, but some very careful econometric work by economist David Altor and his colleagues at MIT say that the opening of China's joining the World Trade Organization in 2001 led to a loss of 2.4 million manufacturing jobs in the United States in the first 10 years of this century. 2.5 million. controlling for all sorts of, controlling for automation, for NAFTA, whatever. Just the China effect, the China shock, we sometimes call it, all right? That's a direct result of open liberalism, deindustrialization. On the right is a graph, it's called the elephant graph. You probably can guess why. And this is a kind of a complicated graph, and there's some things to celebrate in this graph. But this is an economist called Branko Milanovic, and he gathered tons of data starting in the 1980s to try to figure out who has won from globalization, who has won more, and who's won less. And so at the far right, the letter C, that's the richest people, the richest of the rich in the world. And they were already rich in the 80s, and they're even richer now. They've done really brilliantly. You know, some of these people, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs or hedge fund people or what have you. On the left is the poorest, and this is global data. These are global data. The left is the poorest of the poor in the world, and they've done okay, but as you move from left to right, you see, some of the poor have done actually pretty well. And a lot of this is India and China, which have grown pretty big middle classes since the 1980s. But notice the dip. I just want to talk about that dip in the letter B. That is, in large part, the working class in Europe and North America and some, say, Japan. And notice they're sitting at zero. They haven't moved since the 80s. All right, so there's a lot to be happy about, right? The body of the elephant, these are people in what we used to call the third world who are so much better off materially. I'll not say anything about letter C, the far right. Let's just focus on the people who are sitting at zero. So some say this is populism in a graph. This helps you understand what's going on and what open liberalism. And so the people on the far right end, letter C, have hardly noticed that so many millions of people are sitting on zero in their own countries. So then there's cultural and political consequences, and here's where polarization comes in. You can't see, so the colors don't come out in the graph on the left. This is from my colleague James Davis and Hunter, but the left and the right are both curved, and it's showing left-right polarization and how each side described, if you ask them what's the biggest problem facing the United States today, they give very different answers. And it's remarkably consistent within left and right. It means they're in different media ecosystems. They tune into, they have different discourse, and they also regard each other as dangerous, as the big problem. If only those people would go away. There are even questions my colleagues asked, do you think the country would be better off if the political left or the political right, as the case may be, died? And a disturbing number of people said, yeah, that would be better for the country if they just died. So this is a new problem, this many people with those sentiments and those opinions. I put on the right, I just found this yesterday, comparing Canada and the United States. I think this is from 2023, so a little out of date. I couldn't find anything more recent. So you can see the United States is, the U.S. is the blue curve, Canada is the red. U.S. is more polarized. The center is smaller and the extremes are bigger, fatter. I wanted to find something tracing Canada over time because I'm just curious. I don't live here except in the summers, and I'm curious whether Canada is following suit or if it's holding steady with the big center. But you can see in the United States the polarization is quite severe. And just to bring this point on home, when you have a severely polarized society, when both extremes are huge and regard the other as dangerous, you're ripe for authoritarianism, because both sides will say, well, we can't afford, we're in an emergency with these crazy people, these dangerous people. We need a strong hand at government to handle them, to keep them down. And both sides believe this about the other, right? This is what Spain was like in 1936, or France. We know how this story goes. So I can't lay all the blame at open liberalism's feet. You know, I'm being a bit polemical, but open liberalism does play a role. The way we think about human freedom, the laws and policies we've enacted in the name of human freedom have backfired. So is it time to retire liberalism? One more time with critique. So Patrick Deneen is a very smart political theorist, Notre Dame, devout Roman Catholic, and he says, yeah, liberalism's a failure. In fact, we should have seen this coming because liberalism was misbegotten from the start. And the problem came with individual autonomy. That's not a Christian doctrine. It's anti-Christian. And liberalism destroys communities. But, and I know Patrick, he's a friend, and I, have asked him, so what are the alternatives? And so some say, well, democracy, but not liberal democracy, illiberal democracy. So the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, uses this phrase. We've got a democracy, just not a liberal one. So that's what you want. Some out and out say, well, authoritarianism. There's even a small but robust monarchist movement in the United States. And I don't think they mean what you have here, constitutional monarchy under Charles. They mean something a bit more hard-edged than that. Or socialism. And I'll be careful here. Some aren't really into the democratic socialism so much as something a bit more coercive. Why? Because what we have is not working. I just want to say these are regimes that have bad track records, and I think we should be very reluctant to jettison liberal democracy when we have a lot of history about that tells us how these other regimes go. So my last point is I think it's time to think about, to realize we're in a transition such as we've had before, where the extant dominant version of liberalism we have just isn't working the way it's supposed to. It did work for a while. It was never perfect, but it really is counterproductive now. And so this is Charles Taylor at the top and a guy called Owen Cass, a young economist on the bottom, who have some interesting ideas. And there are lots of people thinking this through from various angles. But what's the chief threat to liberty now? It is no longer the year 1800. It is no longer 1920. It is no longer 1970. And just as an opening move, I say, well, imposed perpetual, it's this paradox that we have to choose all the time. What's that recent movie, Everything All at Once? It's this enforced, Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, says we live in liquid modernity, and there's no escape. You can try, but you can't even go to Mars. Why? Because Elon Musk is going to get there first. This way of doing liberalism leaves a lot of people behind. They know it. Their life chances are not what they have been promised, and they know they're looked down on. And even the supposed winners, it kind of circles at universities and so on. Lots of people are on medication. They're not really happy. They're not really coping very well. They're just able to present as coping. So what's the remedy? And here I'm not foolish enough to lay out a plan, but I do think in general, the liberalism we need to preserve liberal democracy is one that doesn't penalize people who want to commit to communities, to families, to a career path, to a country or a part of a country. And that means the open liberal disdain for traditional boundaries and institutions and communities needs to decrease. Again, it works for some people, but not enough. It's really not a democratic kind of liberalism we've had. So the good life pictured in this pluralistic liberalism is one where individuals can more easily commit to families, communities, work, institutions. How to get there? It's the work of a generation. And these people pictured are some of the people thinking about this. So I'll close with these thoughts. Rather than get rid of liberal democracy, we need to admit there's something wrong. I mean, we can't wish it away. And it's not just a matter of electing the right people and the problem goes away. It's really a job for society. One thing to do is depolarize. This is something I have to work on myself. More sympathy for people you disagree with, getting to know them as people, listening to them, being willing to change your mind or rethink something. And even if you disagree in the end, you've learned something and they may have learned something about you. I want to make clear this is not a nostalgic call. I may sound nostalgic sometimes, but it's not a call for a return to classical or welfare liberalism. There's a reason why we had to get rid of those, right? We had to move on. But we need a liberalism that meets the challenges we have now, not the ones we wish we had or that we used to have. Liberalism is, fourth point, is about individual consent. I do, as I said, I think this is something Christians need to value in a pluralistic, high-tech society, because the alternatives can be pretty awful. The last point, the church can help. And I want to be clear, the church's main job is not to save liberal democracy. It's not to uphold the United States of America or Canada, any of that. That's not the job. The job is to make disciples and to be the bride of Christ preparing for his return. However, there's all kinds of work within that broad framework we can do to help our brothers and sisters, to help our societies flourish. And we can hinder in the work, and I'm afraid in my own country there's been a lot of that, or we can help. So we should call on God to show us how to help. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Owen. That was fascinating, enlightening, and very, very helpful. So, friends, we've got an opportunity to engage in some conversation, and I will invite you to come to one of the mics. And once again, for those of you who are online, you can email into questions@rgnt.net. And it looks like we've got some folks coming to the mic. We'll go with Everett there, first of all. Thank you.
Thanks.
Professor Hamner.
John, I'm having the pleasure of teaching a course right now here on climate theology and storytelling, coming from the U.S. as well.
Okay.
And I wanted to raise one of the 21st century challenges you just invited us to think about how a pluralistic fourth form of liberal democracy might engage. When we think about the situation we're in, the spaceship we're all flying around on is breaking, and we are breaking it as a species. How do you see a fourth version of this pluralistic democracy, pluralistic liberal democracy, being able to change our solutions at the global scale, at the pace that we need to, differently than the current neoliberal or open liberal system that we currently have?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I want to say why it's hard before I even try to take a stab at an answer. It's hard because, all else equal, a globalized world has an easier time of addressing something like climate change. I assume you're alluding to climate change, yeah. In fact, it's tried, right, through a number of international accords and so on. So insofar as that's a priority, the first cut at this is not encouraging. And I do think, however, that a big problem, and I can just speak for my own country, is a lack of trust. So there are people who don't know whom to believe, and so they go with the tribe. And that's, you have political paralysis about all kinds of things, but including this.
Sure.
Right? So pushing back against that problem of, so what I'm calling for in pluralistic liberalism is a de-emphasis of globalization, which risks, I think, is a risk of what you're talking about. But what you get in return, I hope, if this is done right, is a restoration of more trust within societies, so that when a politician you disagree with, you didn't vote for, says something, you don't automatically think it's a lie and something you and your tribe need to squash, right? So I think, and there have been previous eras when certainly the democracies of the world addressed common problems, including environmental problems, generations ago, acid rain and so on, where you did not have nearly as globalized a system. But you did have international cooperation. You had more trust within countries, and you were able to address these things. So that's the best I can do. But I didn't use the word trust in the talk, but I should have. I think trust is absolutely a massive thing here. Yeah.
It's certainly key for getting over the disinformation, plague that we're dealing with.
Right.
I'll let others jump in.
Good.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Your proposal for pluralistic liberalism, is the democracy still in there? Is it still a hybrid with liberal democracy? And indeed, that is part of my question. Is there a kind of a need for the safeguarding the democracy part of that hybrid system? Because we see kind of, the power of, let's say, money behind the decision making, so the democracy seems less effective.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, just to flesh. I'm glad you asked this, because it gives me a chance to flesh out the point a little bit more. So I think open liberalism, put in place by some well-intentioned people, they certainly didn't mean. I think most of them did not mean to shrink the realm of democracy, but that's been in effect. So pluralistic liberalism, as I envisage it, returns, because it validates, it's truly pluralistic, it doesn't privilege people who live in this kind of liquid world and want to be able to change everything all the time, but it values people who like commitment and doesn't penalize them for that. That already is a democratic move. Right? And I want to be careful. I would like to have a pluralistic liberalism that doesn't penalize, people who want to work on Wall Street either. Right? This may be impossible, but I do think the open liberalism is just way too skewed. I think all the data, economic and cultural data, just show this. So if we could return to something truly pluralistic, it is by definition more democratic. So many people are opting out of the system now because they don't see the point, and they're not wrong necessarily. They're living under a regime that feels like a distant empire rather than a close democracy. And I think it's because they're not, their decisions don't matter. They're scorned when they're paid attention to at all. So, yeah. So this is kind of vague and abstract, but that's what I'm aiming for. Yeah.
John, I think that sometimes we find these conversations, intriguing and so on, but they're also so close to us but they can also feel overwhelming. There's just so many factors, and it makes me think about the place of education in these kinds of conversations. So at all different levels in schools and so on, undergrad. But speak to me. I'm the new president of Regent College. What should we have in our curriculum to be helping this conversation to go forward in a way that fosters the sort of trust that you're talking about, allows for the subtleties and the nuance that are required, but that can also translate into broader communities to help people really understand what's at stake in all of these conversations?
Good. So I think I'll just answer first of all in terms of political theory, but not kind of abstract. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in today's democracies about what human freedom is or ought to be or could be. And so I'll start out with the word autonomy, and I've dealt with a lot of colleagues on this. So autonomy understood in a certain way is I think all wrong for Christians in the church. And I said it a half hour ago that we don't invent our own laws. But if you look at the way that, say, a heterodox philosopher, Immanuel Kant, thought about autonomy, it's actually quite different from that. Kant said there is a moral law out there. God, now by God he doesn't mean the triune God, I'll have to set that aside. But God put this law out there. But it's obligatory on me when I consent to it. So I have to consent freely to it. I can't adopt it because somebody made me adopt it, because it's not really I'm violating my own conscience by obeying this law. I don't really believe it's the law. I think it's arbitrary. It's a kind of a tyranny. So that's different from what the modern person means by autonomy, which again is, well, I just make it up. I can do what I want, be whatever I want. That's more autopoiesis. I don't speak Greek, but it's more about self-fashioning or self-creation. So this sounds like a really pedantic point, but I think it's important to understand the choice is not between, we all make it up as we go along and we're our own authorities, or we live under some kind of rigid theocracy. Because I think there are people on both sides who think that's the choice. And it's actually a false choice. That if you live in a regime that really values individual consent, as we do, it doesn't mean you're a radical relativist. You can recognize that God is actually God, but He gives you the privilege of recognizing that, consenting yourself, and it's good to live in a regime that also allows you to do that. So, thinking about concepts, I think these are quite basic, but I'm afraid, again, speaking from the American context, a lot of my students have no idea about this, and as teaching at a secular university, most of my students would embrace the relativistic view of autonomy without really realizing it or without being able to defend it. They just reflexively think, I get to decide everything for myself, and if it doesn't hurt anybody else, why not? But I push them on, do you really mean that? Because do you really think that nothing's wrong unless nothing's just naturally wrong, or and so that kind of education is probably not a problem here at Regent, I would hope, but people here, people even come here, they've absorbed the categories from the surrounding culture, and they've been educated probably a lot of them in a similar way to I'm used to back in the States. So that's one thing. And the second thing really is, again, probably not directly relevant to Regent, but I've been disappointed over really a number of years at how we teach about these democracies we live in. They are certainly imperfect. They've committed crimes. I could go on. But the problem is that's most of what happens. The students I teach have had many years of hearing how awful the regime, and now that they sense it's in danger, they're not quite sure what it is that's in danger, because they're not sure what is worth preserving. They haven't really been taught that. And so I talk about the rule of law, and the rule of law. Say more, I shouldn't have to say more, but I do. So I think education is absolutely crucial to this. Most people sense there's something really big at stake in a number of our democracies, but we can't quite tell what it is. And I think that's a failure of education in part. So, yeah.
Thank you. Sam, please.
Thank you again for the lecture, Dr. Owen. So I was wondering if you can elaborate a bit more on how the church can help, and also if there are reflexes you've noticed in churches or even the global church that haven't been helpful every time there is a crisis.
Yeah, so how the church can help. I cannot give a global answer because I'm, again, live in this. I'm an American, live in the States, and my impression, having spent a lot of time here, and I'll say in the UK and Germany, just places I've spent on sabbatical or know a lot of people in. The evangelical church in the United States tends to be right of center, and the evangelical church in most of these other countries tends to be left of center, I would say, certainly on economic affairs. So I'm not able to give a global answer, except this really minimal and maybe obvious one, which is the church should not be partisan fundamentally. Christians, I encourage Christians to vote. I respect Anabaptism, but I'm not an Anabaptist. Christians should vote. They should be informed when they vote. They should vote their conscience, but should also realize that we're not all going to come out in the same way. I really encourage American Christian friends of mine to visit or at least get to know evangelicals from just north of the border here or the UK, and or frankly, white Christians get to know some black Christians who all love Jesus but vote differently and talk differently about candidates and parties. It's really important to recognize what we have in common and what is different, and to make sure we're holding up what we have in common as the most important thing. Right? So that's some kind of generic advice that gets back to my emphasis on pluralism. Within that, so saying, So second point is going to be quick. Within your own country, it's tempted to be very frustrated and fold up and say, forget it. Politics is a dirty business. Come, Lord Jesus, get us out of here. And he may. I pray that prayer myself. But he may not. A lot of our ancestors prayed the same prayer, and he didn't come. So I think we should assume we're probably he wants us here to do some of this work, and not to lose confidence in where he's put us and why. Because I see a lot of frustration, and again, I'm a political scientist for crying out loud, and sometimes I feel like throwing up my hands and just. I study this stuff, but I hate it, or I'm not going to vote this time, or something like that. So those may seem obvious points, but I'm finding some wavering in people and churches I know on these points. So again, point one: recognize the plurality of points of view in the evangelical churches around the world. And second, be willing to roll up your sleeves and stay in the city of man we're in right now. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
David.
Thank you, John, for the challenge you've taken on this evening to speak about such very, very big questions and make some sense of them. And inevitably, there's a lot of place for quibbling about categories and whatnot. But I think your organizing framework of the three eras is one that a number of social scientists would agree with, and they would also agree that the neoliberal or open liberal, as you call it, period is ending. It will never truly end, but it's ending. All of these periods are always constantly mixed up with each other, but right. One appears dominant at certain periods of time. I taught a course on globalization for several decades at UBC, and about 15 years ago, I realized I had to start talking about anti-globalization.
Yeah, right.
You just couldn't assume that globalization was the end of the story. But what does that anti-globalization look like? That's the question I really want to take up here, or your final period of plural liberalism. I noticed that with the first three periods, what you gave us was a pretty accurate description of key themes during that era. I would suggest that in the fourth one, what you've given us is a prescription, not a description. In other words, it's what we might like to see, but sadly, it's not what we actually see. Because I think what we actually see is a movement towards authoritarianism in all of the largest countries in the world, the most significant countries. The US, China, India, Russia, and smaller countries like Israel. In each case, we see a centralization of power, which in fact is overriding precisely those democratic institutions that we hold up as part of the democratic project. And so I can't be as optimistic as you are looking at the world as it is, as compared to the world that we might like it to be. So that's my question.
Yeah, you're right. I am prescriptive. Part of this is editors saying, well, all right, smart guy, what should we do? Because your readers are going to want to know. Yes, I would say, I would put the matter a little bit differently if I move to description of our current period. I'm worried about lots of things, most of which you've mentioned, I think. But I think we're in the middle of a transition rather than at a place where we can say, this is the next phase. Our period reminds me of the 1930s in very unsettling ways. But the 30s I see as a transition, not, and partly kids, we know how the story ended. It's a post hoc analysis. Whereas now we're in the middle of things. We're in medias res. We don't know. So neither you nor I knows. But I think I would, if I had to bet, I guess I am betting intellectually that liberal democracy has weathered storms before. May not weather this one. You may be right. But the fact that it's proven as flexible as it has and adaptable as it has, for better and sometimes for worse, but I think on the whole for better, makes me think it has the resources to do so again, but it could get worse before it gets better. The 30s and the early 40s were really horrible, right? I mean, truly, worse than what we have now. So that's how I would put. But I would say neither of us knows. We periodize as best we can, and I think we're in transition rather than able to draw conclusions about. So that's how I'd answer it.
Good, thank you very much. Please.
I'm going to try and summarize this as best as I can because my brain's firing in lots of directions. I read a paper years and years ago when I was studying political science about, it's called The Liberal State of Unfreedom, where there's two sides of the coin of liberalism, which is one which is incredibly authoritarian, and the other side which is equality and freedom and all of those things. And I guess I'm from Australia, and so the backbone of Australian liberalism is of obviously like settler colonialism and genocides and massacres, and then now like a liberal democracy. And I think it's really interesting in the times we find ourselves in now, where like the open market and where government doesn't really have much control anymore, where markets kind of get to determine what's happening, and I think that the climate change stuff is really interesting because it's like, how much power do governments actually have to be able to set the scene now? Where, for example, we're looking at how do we lessen the effects of climate change, not prevent anymore. And so obviously there's that shift to renewable energy. And what does that shift actually look like on the ground? And largely that's going to be huge increases in mining around the globe in terms of things like lithium and
including in Australia, right?
Including Australia, yeah. And places like Australia with a horrible track record for respecting Indigenous sovereignty of land, where
Can we get to the end of that?
My brain.
try to land on a question.
So how do we kind of shepherd in this new period in a way where we can continue to try and preserve these core concepts of liberalism in a way, I don't know.
Yeah,
how do we steer the ship?
Yeah, it's a fleshed out version of maybe the question earlier on climate change, and I don't have an answer. I can say I think the problem is pretty severe, and I would just throw in geopolitical competition. My home turf is actually international relations, so I look a lot at China-U.S. rivalry, and it's driving the AI revolution in ways I hadn't realized. I was in Silicon Valley about 6 weeks ago, and people were talking a ton about China. That's also driving a lot of the lithium mining because rare earths, the West may need its own independent sources. Australia's right there, yay, So it's a severe long-term problem or set of wicked problems. But I'll resort to the answer I gave a minute ago, which is I think one foundational problem we've had in our countries is lack of trust. And I'd be curious about the Australian context. I don't know, my sense is it's not as polarized as the United States. So good for Australia, but a lot of our countries really have severe trust problems, so that it's hard to make big decisions. And when you make big decisions, you pass a big, beautiful bill, for example, it's hated by about half the population. I mean, really hated. There's no consensus really, and this is just proving a massive problem. So the problems you describe are big problems that require consensus, and some of our democracies are in no condition to make those decisions. So that's all I can say. That is not a full answer, but it's maybe a start. So,
thanks for your patience.
Friends, we're coming to the close of our evening. We have one more question here from Paul, and that will be our final question of the night.
Great. Thanks so much for speaking tonight. Really appreciate your contributions. Recently, I've come across some thinking and writing from people like Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin, which I found very strange and disturbing, including this dehumanization, where not all are equal. Is there anything about this that we should actually take seriously, or is this signaling something? How should we treat and respond to these thinkers?
Yeah, so I read a little bit of these folks. Intellectually very interesting. And Peter Thiel's an important, he's a billionaire who reads hard books and, has lots of ideas. So I think, in kind of a meta level, we should take seriously that the West, not just the West, has some seriously alternative ideas that we might associate with the right that wouldn't have been voiced before a few years ago, and they're now being voiced. So Yarvin's a blogger. I don't know as much about him, but Thiel's consequential, and Yarvin has a huge following. We should pay attention to the prominence of these voices. That's just a meta point, not getting into what they're saying. A second thing, I'll say on Thiel, I'm one of those people who's intrigued. I hear a lot of things that are weird, but he's adopting a kind of a heterodox Christian position on some things that could go in a really bad, dark direction. But he's thinking very hard about what the work that he and his friends in Silicon Valley do and what it might mean for the human future. I think it's, believe me, a lot of people in Silicon Valley don't think about that at all. They're just solving problems. And so if Thiel can broaden the conversation, I have a feeling I would not agree with where he lands, but I encourage, so insofar, I'll say one other thing, insofar as there's ethical thinking in Silicon Valley, it's mostly utilitarian, maximize pleasure, minimize pain. AI is going to help us do that better than ever. So what's the problem? It's just, and Thiel comes at it from a very different angle. And I've been disturbed for the last 6 weeks of how in Silicon Valley there's a lot of money and a lot of brilliant people who have a very restricted view of morality. It's just about pain and pleasure. So I'll throw in this, that there are other people you should pay attention to who are, so I have a colleague at Notre Dame called Megan Sullivan who's thinking really hard about the same problems but from a virtue ethics perspective. She reads Aristotle and Aquinas and Alistair McIntyre, and she has got a big fat grant to look at these problems too, in a way that I'm much more comfortable, I think is much better. So again, to come around to my original point, we're at a time of real intellectual ferment, and it's unpredictable, and some of it's unsettling, but it's telling us that important things are happening. We are in, again, what I call a transition period. This is not a normal period. Okay, so we have some of the richest people in the world reading hard books and talking about ideas. So thanks for your question. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Owen. This has been amazing. Thank you. Friends, thank you so much for coming this evening. Thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to all of you who asked questions. As you leave, you'll have an opportunity. If you would like to make a contribution, there's a donation box at the door, and you can also make a contribution electronically at rgnt.net/give. Also, this evening's lecture will become available on Regent College's YouTube channel. And so if you look at that from time to time, you'll see past lectures, and then this lecture will also become available in due course. We have another evening lecture this week on Wednesday. Dr. Brittany Kim is speaking to us about Hagar, Leah, and the God who sees. On Wednesday at lunchtime, we have a lunchtime conversation with Professor Everett Hamner, who was right with us here today, and he's talking about climate crisis and the imagination. And then next week on Monday, we have David Smith here again in the evening speaking to us about faith, hope, and the purposes of schooling. So perhaps there will be a tie-in there for all of us. So that just remains for me to say thank you for coming and have a good night.